In recent times, video gaming addiction has made its way into the media, with teens completing 22 straight gaming marathons and dying, to treatment centres popping up all over the world. In professional domains, it has come in as a clinical syndrome that requires further study, but I wonder whether this could be applied to tabletop gaming as well. So this is the DSM-5, and it's known as the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's what I and other mental health professionals use to help diagnose mental illness and disorders, and it came out in 2013 from the American Psychiatric Association. What was really controversial about this was that they had a section at the back for further studies, and it's diagnoses that aren't useful for clinical use at the moment, but things that require further study, and game addiction was one of those. So it had certain criteria that I'm going to go through with you to constitute what is a gaming addiction. So the first thing is being preoccupied. This means that you're constantly thinking about gaming and nothing else, and it's almost taking over your life. You know, part of this might be staying up very, very late into the late hours and not sort of doing anything else really. The second thing, which I think is really prominent in addiction, is that people would experience withdrawal symptoms. Now, there are no physiological symptoms coming from gaming addiction, like if a heroin addict stops taking opioids, then they would have shakes, vomiting, and other physical health issues. Now, they identified withdrawal symptoms for gaming addiction would be things like irritation, aggression, and sadness if they didn't have access to their games. The third criteria is tolerance. This is needing more and more time on the games to get that same kind of feeling. The next one is an unsuccessful attempt to curb how much you're using that time. So this would be someone actually recognizing that there is problems, psychosocial problems, and actually not being able to stop themselves playing more and more. Following that is the loss of interest in anything else. So a little bit like preoccupation, this would be someone, losing all interest in other hobbies and other things they used to enjoy, and that this becomes their primary source of, I suppose, positive reinforcement, what people enjoy. The next criteria alongside that is sort of continued excessive use. People are talking about 20 to 30 hours a week of internet gaming, which I didn't actually think was that much if you end up playing every night, but that is something that they defined, and I suppose we can have a chat about later. Deceiving others about the amount that you use internet gaming is also one of the criteria, and jeopardizing, I suppose, relationships, career moves, education, opportunities, that's also seen as one of the criteria. And I think that's one of the most important factors when you're thinking about whether or not someone has an addiction, is that it's negatively impacting on multiple aspects of your life, and you kind of have that ability to no longer function. Finally, they talk about using internet gaming as a way to relieve or get rid of a negative mood, which seems like a little bit of an odd one, because I suppose you're not just doing it for pleasure, but you're actually doing it to try and take away some of those negative feelings, which I think could be argued otherwise, because why else would you do distractions? A lot of people, I think, would rather do something than sit with their own misery. So in order to meet this criteria for diagnosis, you only need to meet 5 of these criteria, which isn't much. And I think a lot of us could maybe have a few of these seen elsewhere. But like I said, for me, the main factor is whether or not I think would someone have an addiction is if it's negatively impacting on those aspects of their lives and stopping them functioning day to day. So one study in Asia, and I suppose maybe we need to take into account cultural norms and how gaming is viewed, and sort of, I suppose, the amount that people are expected to work and help others needs to be considered. But they found that the point prevalence in males was 8.4% would meet the criteria for this diagnosis of internet gaming addiction, whereas 4.5% of females would meet that. There was argument whether there was a genetic disposition to this, but I'd also argue that socially we have that socialization that boys game, so I think that could be a contributing factor to that. More recently, the World Health Organization has joined suit and they have identified gaming disorder as a diagnosis, and I think we're likely to see that in the International Classifications of Diseases revision 11, which we're going to have in November. This is what mainly sort of Europe and outside of the US tend to use to diagnose. So, you know, I suppose it's not just one board or one body taking that into account. Other kind of cultures and sort of different professionals are agreeing that this could be a real thing. Much like, I suppose, internet game gambling addiction has been around for quite some time.
This morning, the World Health Organization raising a red flag, for the first time adding gaming disorder to their list of addictive activities, likening it to substance abuse and gambling disorders.
So the criteria that WHO, which is the World Health Mental Organization, outlined for this is slightly different to what the DSM outlines, but both say that it has to be prevalent for 12 months or so. They believe that the first criteria is characterized by an impaired ability to game, which I found quite interesting. So if you're playing, I assume, playing for such long periods that your ability to perform on that game is impaired, which I thought that was quite interesting. Whether or not maybe that's linked to tilting and, you know, sort of being emotionally disturbed by the game, or whether that's physiologically you're just so tired you can't do so. I think that adds to it. The second criteria that they add is slightly like the last criteria from the DSM, in that internet gaming becomes an absolute priority over anything else, which I think is right for an addiction. It becomes the sole thing that occupies someone's life. And then following that, I suppose the last one that they outline is that someone who is, I suppose, focusing on this and using more and more internet gaming, despite knowing that there are negative consequences. So there's some similarities between the two. So what if then we applied this to tabletop gaming? Do you think it would really matter? So I suppose some of those criteria I could see being quite translatable in terms of the amount we use, the way that we would prioritize that over something. I think that would be a problem regardless of what it is. So maybe there is some parity between the two. I suppose when I think about myself, there is definitely some of these criteria that if we were thinking in tabletop gaming terms, I would certainly meet it. So I added up over the last 2 years kind of how much that I've spent on this hobby, and it's amounted to over £7,000, which I thought was really excessive. However, I suppose when I'm thinking about whether or not this is impacting negatively on my life, I still have a roof over my head, I can still feed myself, and yeah, it's not ruining my life in that way, despite burning out my wallet. You know, the whole name of this channel being The Plastic Crack is that, you know, a joke that I think a lot of wargamers get is that, you know, you keep buying more and more miniatures almost as if it were an addiction, you know, because we're collectors at heart. But I suppose it hasn't necessarily escalated to a problem where it's damaged my relationships. I suppose far from it. Me and my partner play board games quite regularly. I actually go and socialise with others. However, I suppose those gaming friends are prioritised over others. When you're talking about internet gaming addiction, the prioritisation of online friends versus real life friends is seen as quite a negative. But I suppose these are people I'm physically going to meet up with and see, although I do have a vast amount of conversation with people over Facebook all around the globe that I don't know. I mean, hell, I'm talking to a camera and talking to you guys now. I suppose definitely in terms of preoccupation, there are times when I find myself definitely preoccupied by tabletop games, especially when there's new releases, when we've got tournament coming up, you know, or maybe even when I'm just invested in a new army. I definitely find that I'm constantly thinking about it. How might I paint it? I want to be home, I want to be building them, I want to get them on the table. How would this army work? How might I use it? So it definitely, I think a level of preoccupation is certainly there, but it hasn't ruined, I suppose, you know, my ability to go to work, my ability to function within society. So I think that's the limit. But then perhaps maybe there are some people out there who cross that line. You know, hoarders who have spent all of their money and gotten into a significant amount of debt for this hobby. People who only will play with other gamers. People that don't think about anything else and prioritize that above everything. So I could see that it could be translated. So maybe there is such a thing as the wargaming addiction that might need to be considered in the future. So I would love to know your thoughts and experiences on this. Do you think wargaming truly could be addictive, or is it just a, I suppose, moral crisis from society that thinks that not going outside and playing in the sunshine is a sin? So let me know what you think. I'd be really excited to hear from you guys, and I'll catch up with you soon.